Alrighty, so we have a few folks joining. So hello, everyone. This is the February 12th edition of SIG Release. This is a meeting that will be recorded and available on YouTube, so please be mindful of everything that you say and be sure to adhere to the CNCF and Kubernetes Code of Conduct. The first thing we've got up is we recently did a SIG update for the community meeting. Tim Pepper took care of that. So Tim, if you want to give some highlights of that update.
It was mostly just kind of a rundown. The slides are linked there, but kind of a rundown of what we did in the prior quarter, what's going on, and this quarter. For folks who haven't been attending the community meeting, maybe it's only been in the last little while that they've kind of established a bit of a template. So there's kind of getting to be a cadence of content and commonality across the SIGs as they present. So basically just giving that general update. And then I went into a bit about release engineering as well, since I've been thinking about that and we needed some filler for the slides, I guess, or for the conversation, just to talk about where we see some things going in the coming release cycle.
So yeah, so I think broad overview is the spin up of our new sub projects. So namely firming up some of the process around the release team, which has been well established, but we're constantly iterating over that process every release cycle. The release engineering team, which is an amalgam of the processes and the tools and the people that are involved in cutting a Kubernetes release. So those are the patch release management team, the branch managers, and everyone who has their hands on Kubernetes/release. So if you've never seen that repo or read up on that, I'll post links in the chat in a second. And then finally, the licensing subproject that is myself, Nikita, Dims, and Steve Winslow from the Linux Foundation. So that project is kind of centered around making sure that Kubernetes, all of the repos and projects that live within the Kubernetes orgs are license compliant for an open source project. So building process around that, as well as doing licensing scans and things of that sort, and reporting things that are out of compliance. So those both the release engineering and licensing subprojects are slowly kicking off. If you are interested in either of those efforts, please let me know, let myself, Tim, or Caleb know, and we'll figure out ways to plug you in. Any questions there? All right. So one of the bigger things that was also covered on the slide deck and came up this release cycle is that we made it mandatory to have KEPs for each of the features or enhancements that were coming into the 1.14 release cycle for Kubernetes. So there was quite a bit of friction around that. So new process, that's to be expected. But I think we had a lot of good takeaways, and the end result of that was having an updated KEP template, and lots of action items around that template and how to improve the documentation. So I mentioned this in the SIG PM meeting earlier today, but the plan is to have a retrospective around the enhancements freeze process specifically within the one of the SIG PM time slots to kind of just go over what we could have done better when we're introducing new process changes like that. And so anyone who is, that's to be scheduled, but anyone who is interested in attending that as well, feel free to reach out to me and I'll make sure that it's on your calendar. Any questions around that stuff? Okay, cool. So there's an item here about cleaning up the SIG release CI boards. Do we have whoever put that up on the call?
Yeah, it was me. I just want to let people know what's going on. Particularly, I don't think Aaron's on here either, is he?
You mentioned he was on vacation.
Oh, good for him.
Seriously.
Yeah. So we're in the process of cleaning up all of the test grid boards for the release tests. So far, what we've done, all the work has focused on SIG Release Master. What we've done so far is to split that into blocking and informing based on the blocking criteria PR passed by Aaron in December in terms of blocking criteria. So we split into blocking and informing. We moved several things to informing. Since then, some of those are being moved to other SIGs because they really belong to other SIGs and we don't care about them from a release perspective. Like I have a PR open, all of the kube control SKU tests, which are really belong to SIG CLI, are moving to their test grid. And we won't even look at them anymore, not that we were looking at them in the first place. And so once that happens, the one other remaining thing to do is that Aaron has an effort open to identify owning teams for all of the jobs. And if a job is defined as really genuinely not having an owning team, that one is also going to at least come off blocking, if not the grid entirely. Because if no one owns it, we can't fix it. And if we can't fix it, why run it? And that's open has been a bit of a slog for an effort. One of the questions for this group is, part of the idea behind doing this to SIG Release Master is that when we split off the 114 tests, those are going to have the same set of tests that SIG Release Master has, not the set of tests that we've had for previous release versions. One question is, do we want to make the previous release versions set of jobs match what we consider the current jobs, or we just want to leave them the way they are?
So when you say previous, are you meaning 113 and earlier?
Yes.
Okay. My response would be to leave them as they have been. Just thinking that there was an established criteria at the time of branching and it keeps clarity for the branch managers.
Okay.
What do others think?
I'm fairly far away from the process, so I defer to people who have actually been touching the code and CI branches.
Sounds like do what you like until such time we have more information that it was the wrong thing to do.
What was your thought, Josh? Because the way it was set in the notes.
I can see either course as being equally valid. Obviously it's less work to just leave the previous ones the way they are. Wait, less work for a human, more work for a computer, because ultimately we've been effectively discarding some jobs.
So what leaves us in the better state long term?
Well, I would say what Josh was saying there, do not do things that help the computers do their job. That's what they're paid to do.
Okay. Okay, so we won't, so barring a request otherwise, we just won't touch the old branches.
Sounds good to me.
Okay.
Cool.
That was it.
All right. Any other thoughts on that before we move on? All right, we're speeding through this. So the last one that's on the agenda for today is the idea of tracking out of tree features and how that should be done. Nishi gave a write-up on a SIG release issue. There's been a little discussion there. Would love to see some more discussion. Definitely, I owe some comments there. Would love to see the other chairs jump in as well. Anyone who is interested in commenting on that, go for it. I think the overall gist is the way that we're currently tracking out of tree features, are the requirements for tracking out of tree features are not well defined. So the expectation is that someone who is doing something out of tree will be held to a similar standard for people who are releasing Kubernetes code or processes. The part of it is towards the end of the release cycle, we request SIGs to supply release themes. And I don't think this is the appropriate place for release themes to be tracked. The changelog should be changes to Kubernetes or Kubernetes processes and kind of like anything that might be related to that. There is a better presentation mechanism that maybe doesn't exist yet, but we need to talk about how that can be done so that SIGs can have, if it's an LWKD style thing or a contributor site style thing, to allow SIGs to say, oh, during the 114, 115 timeframe, this is what we were up to, right? But it's something that should not be included in the Kubernetes changelog. That's my opinion. That is not a view of SIG release. That's just me saying what I think. So.
I feel like this is a really big question, because within Nishi's question, I think, is what is Kubernetes? And what is the output of the release process? Are we demonstrating that Kubernetes 114 works in the narrow or relative to a specific reference implementation or integration, or reference integration? And that starts to feel like a reference distribution. There's been talk of kernel versus distribution, and that kind of verges on architecture and steering level discussion, I feel like, and we've always ended up stuck on this conversation. And I see two things that are interesting examples. I believe, so Nishi hadn't put this on the agenda, but I had seen her pinging for me to update, and I've kind of stayed on the side wanting more input from others, but that's why I bring it up here, to maybe foster a little more discussion. But I believe she's coming at it from a perspective of the SIG AWS work in 113. They had some questions around stuff that's effectively out of tree-ish or going to be out of tree, but they wanted to declare it GA in 113, but it had never gone through beta, much less alpha. And there was a question of, well, can we hold them to that standard or expectation? Is that fair? And there wasn't clear documentation, I guess, or the decision was made to have them go through the normal process because things were still in tree, but it begs the question of where we're headed. And then the other example that this has me thinking of is the SIG Windows promotion of Windows containers to stable GA. One of the things that Nishi proposes is, well, maybe it should just be up to the SIG to decide the state of their things. And that's kind of where SIG Windows has been, saying, yep, we're ready. But then you get exactly what's happened, where the SIG believes it's ready and the broader project says, well, wait a minute, we'd like to see some slightly different things. And that's created a lot of contention and bad feelings, I think, around how all of that's played out. And it comes back to not having a documented process and clear criteria that people can understand up front. So they felt like the bar was being moved on them continually over the last 9 months.
Few releases, yeah. So I mean, this is something that we I kind of poked at during the SIG architecture birds of a feather for KubeCon Seattle, and said, like, we don't have project-wide graduation criteria. Like, things like this are going to keep happening until we do. And I try to mention it in any meeting that, like, the topic gets anywhere close to that. So I kind of agree that the bar, it was an invisible bar, and like it hasn't necessarily been moving. I think, there were some expectations, some unsaid expectations, and they need to be written down. Like, I think that's where we are. So any volunteers? No.
Yeah, one of the other things that's, I think, going to help actually with doing the release is we need to start looking at separating the PR from the release notes.
Yeah, already working on it. Although, sorry.
Well, I'm thinking specifically about, because, like, increasingly everything's moving to plugins. right? And what's appropriate for the release notes, the only thing that'd be appropriate for the release notes is a new plugin being enabled in a specific version of Kubernetes, right? Like if we have a new, storage plugin or something that couldn't run before and can now run on Kubernetes version 115, then that's appropriate for the release notes. But in the release announcement, it's completely appropriate to list all of the plugins that have had updates and new releases and stuff. If you follow me?
Yeah, I guess this goes back to my original guidance. I'm thinking about things like LTS release or anything, talking about things that are not developed in Kubernetes. That the idea that there is a shorthand for what is a Kubernetes release. It used to just be the 7 binaries. Once the cluster lifecycle folks introduced the cluster bundle, it should now be that. And now we have an opportunity to, with a declarative configuration, say that this is what a Kubernetes release is, because this is what can be used by tooling to spin up a conformant cluster for users. So I don't think any smaller definition of what a release is particularly helpful. I think that using that definition also allows the same definition to be used by the project itself upstream, but also vendors, because you can also, as a vendor, your conformance, what you check in, should just be your cluster bundle. So a GKE or GCE cluster bundle, AWS one, a vSphere one, a PKS one. You can use the same abstraction to define what it is that your users are going to be spinning up. And you can talk about your specific components that you've changed out from any sort of reference component. But like we have a definition that I just feel like we are not plugging back into the system.
So
but do we actually have the reference implementation data? Like I can imagine a future where, yeah, and Josh is shaking his head no, and I'm throwing it out there as a question because I know that's the answer, but there's been talk about, for the standard interfaces, making reference implementations and something that was worst case a mocked integration, but lacking that to actually make a meaningful statement like what you're describing, Caleb. I feel like we would have to test all the variations.
The vendors have to test all the variations. So if you want to say your Kubernetes distribution is conformant, you should be required to produce said specification that someone else could verify. I mean, there's no way that a single group of people can verify across all the vendors what all of their reference implementations are. I don't think that's a scalable process. But certainly, if you are selling a distribution of Kubernetes, I think there's a totally reasonable bar that if you want to use the trademark, you've got to do this. Like we have a specification for how to spin up a Kubernetes cluster. The folks at Cluster Lifecycle have been working on that for a while. You should use that unless there's some better one available.
So leaving aside that right now nobody is allowed to use the trademark, why do you think everybody's using something with a K and they don't spell out what the K means?
RK is actually
what it sounds like you're arguing for is there is no core definition of what Kubernetes is, there's just vendors.
No, what I'm arguing for is that there is a core definition that is the cluster bundle that went through all of the blocking tests. So today, unfortunately, that means it's validated against GCE and AWS. I think there is work that is already in flight to extract those components and replace them with a non-vendor specific bundle that could, in theory, be deployed by the tooling developed by Cluster Lifecycle.
But
whatever that ends up being is a Kubernetes release.
Except, I mean, consider a future where we have done our proper pushing everything out, right? So There are no core storage drivers, there's just CSI. There are no built-in cloud providers, there is just the cloud provider API. At a certain point, for every different thing that Kubernetes can do, there is a choice of 3 to a dozen different plugins.
So I think that it's valid to say like, hey, Kubernetes, 115 is out. These are all the things that have changed in tree, right? These are all the things that you have changed within that cluster bundle, that defined set of conformance, like that defined set of conformance profiles that are valid for Kubernetes. And if you want to find out more about what has changed in CRI, click here. If you want to find out more about what's changed in CSI, click here. If you want to find out the changes about your cloud provider, here are the links to go to. But I'm saying we need to pull that out of the common changelog.
I don't know if I agree. I think the changelog was never really just for Kubernetes. We just didn't use it that way. We haven't used it that way in long enough that it's just, I don't think it's worth even referring to that previous time. I think that if you look at release notes for a project like Fedora, that's much more applicable to our current case, because there are sections that are relevant to operators who need to spin up a new Kubernetes cluster. There are sections that are relevant to downstream vendors who are building and packaging up additional products on top of Kubernetes. There just needs to be a better place than the changelog.md that is in Kubernetes. I think that's a totally reasonable thing to solve for this group. I think it's slightly separate from the what is a Kubernetes release. And I think to that point, it should be look at the things that are inside the terrible cluster directory. That is what went into the CI process. So calling anything else the release, I don't think is particularly genuine. I would like to see all of the terrible scripts in there replaced with just the declarative specification, which is presumably why we funded, or why multiple companies funded all that engineering work in order to realize that. And so even with everything moving out of tree, you still need an ability to test that all the components are working together. And so whatever those components end up being, I think is not necessarily germane to discussion, but they will exist, because otherwise we cannot have tested the components working together. So those will need to be built at some point. So someone will work on that problem. But I think we already have a good enough definition for what a Kubernetes release is. It is the set of components that have been tested together that, when used together, create for you what we call a conformant Kubernetes cluster.
But the set of components that we have in test grid right now are largely historical in nature.
Yeah, and we are going to that is going to improve as the CSI matures, as CRI matures, as the cloud provider interface restabilizes. So I am fairly confident that will.
We're basically saying that. So your proposal is basically anything that is compliant and represented in test grid could be considered part of Kubernetes as far as the release is concerned.
I am saying that the components and the configuration required to produce a conformant Kubernetes cluster that could be used by a user is what Kubernetes is.
Okay, let me.
I think we're stepping away from like the actual question of the issue, which is how do we track out of tree features or enhancements, right? Is that done within Kubernetes, or is it done somewhere else? Like I don't think we've answered that question.
I would assert that the project itself needs to produce a space to communicate changes about Kubernetes and its ecosystem. Whether those changes landed in Kubernetes SIG someplace else, or some other CNCF controlled repository or sub-project that has been sponsored by a SIG.
What about using the enhancements repo?
I think that KEPS is going to be the mechanism for communicating about proposed enhancements generally into the ecosystem.
So
I think
currently our policy is that if something isn't part of KK, it doesn't get a KEP.
I think
no.
Yeah,
that's not the policy, right? If something is
a CSI driver just got its KEP kicked out because it was external.
If something is
sorry.
Go for it.
No, you take it.
Yeah. Okay. So if anything that's coming into the project, right, that is changing the project should have a KEP. right? What we were saying for the 114 release cycle is that if it is not landing in tree, Kubernetes, it's not changing some code or process around Kubernetes, then we don't care, as the release team, do not care to track it, right? The KEP should still be there, right? There should be a bar, like there should be expectations for everything that comes into the project.
Not what was communicated to the KEP proposer and they closed their KEP.
Okay, I would like to see that KEP so I can follow up.
Okay.
But I guess some more general, I think anything that a SIG sponsors can have a KEP for it. That at the SIG, that this process is supposed to be, it's supposed to tie hand in glove with the rest of the Kubernetes processes. So if there's a sponsored subproject that work is being done against, that's great. If there's a new subproject that a SIG wants to spin up and track work there, I think that's also great. But certainly a SIG should be able to decide what should and should not have a KEP from that SIG standpoint. I certainly didn't have any problem with that.
Yeah, so it looks like Dim has his hands up as well.
Yeah, quick question, Caleb. How do we handle stuff that will end up getting released later after the release goes out, right? Say people have to make a release that will work with our 114 and their releases will come after ours, right? So how do we, but we would like to say something about, that also because it's related, saying that, okay, there's a plan for this to be released soon and look out for that kind of situation too.
I don't think we should be tracking that.
Yeah, so then let me flip the question around. So then how do we go back and do for the previous release, saying, okay, these were the things that would have worked with 113, but
So I don't think it's feasible for us as a project to enumerate all of the things that potentially work with a project. I think that the onus should be, especially if it's an external vendor, the onus should be on them to provide compatibility specs around Kubernetes.
We are talking about community projects, Stephen.
Okay.
Yeah. So for the community projects, how do we do that, Caleb?
So if the project is a sub-project that has been sponsored by a SIG, I think that was your ticket to entry. So my I guess thoughts on this is that as a project, we need to be careful about what SIGs we charter, because the whole point is to give them broad latitude and managing their own affairs for a specific part of the project. And such that we can't trust that, I think that's a problem for the steering committee or SIG architecture. So those are not necessarily the challenges I want to address. But if you are a sub-project that is sponsored by a SIG, so you're somewhere in the community, then you have, in my mind, met the bar to use and to ship information about your enhancement in the official Kubernetes communication channels as they exist, because that's the bar. You're a SIG, you sponsor this work, that's great. Now, should we have a bunch of vendor-specific SIGs? I have consistently argued that we should not. We should organize them into groups that are generic. So there should, in my mind, there should be no SIG AWS, no SIG GCP, no SIG Azure, no SIG IBM Cloud, no SIG VMware. There should all be sub-projects or some other arrangement under SIG Cloud provider. Same thing with SIG storage. There should not be a SIG NetApp. Thank goodness that there is not. But if you are a sub-project, I think specifically AWS has a bunch of these, like little projects that make running Kubernetes on AWS better. I think it's fine for those to be part of a general release announcement, given that they have met the technical standards that exist today for the project. So we need to be more careful about what SIGs we are allowed to charter. That's where I would try to and make these changes.
Right. So, but we will allow forward-looking statements from these SIGs in our changelog, right?
I think that if I would be open to it. So if you are I guess the Kubi builder is an example I could use for this. So you may not be quite ready for, Kubi builder 115 at the time we cut Kubernetes 115. I think that you're fine going out with the release cycle as long as you're like not in the the .6 release of 115. If you're in like the .1, that's probably fine. I think you can take that probably as a case-by-case basis. Certainly, like you should not have a forward-looking announcement for 115 that actually gets delivered in like 117.
Yeah, simpler example will be like kind and Minikube, things like that, where we know that they will come after us.
Yeah, if they come like shortly after, simply because of the technical limitations of the release process, I don't find any need to remove that information because there's not another good time to publish it. Because there's a lot of activity and interest that goes out with our release announcement. So I think I can understand the motivations for wanting to be on that train. And as long as we believe that you are likely to land in that release set, I think that's fine.
How do you judge that though? And would we potentially need to somehow delay the release pending word that kind or Minikube or something like that was good with it?
I don't think so. It's a trust but verify. If you are granted this trust and routinely fail to do so, then we're going to remove it. I think is a reasonable stance to take.
So I think, so I'm curious, like where the line is exactly for things that are out of tree that kind of want to announce themselves. I think that if they have their own space to announce and they bring up their own tentative plans, then it's not on us specifically to capture all of those plans and do the trusting and verifying.
Specifically talking about work that's sponsored by a SIG. And so this again goes back to the why we should not have vendor-specific SIGs.
Right. No. This is not. I understand that it's works sponsored by a SIG, but I'm saying within the scope of the release process, do you think that SIG release should be owning that?
I
don't think so.
The process for getting into the release announcements, I think, is yes. The SIG release does own that process, either SIG release or SIG PM. I'm not super interested in splitting the difference here in this group. Other than that, one of the horizontal SIGs should be responsible for that.
Right. So it's less about who owns that process specifically and the things that would be coming into that process, right? So if they're failing to meet that, or we're like, how many projects that we plan on tracking that are within Kubernetes, the Kubernetes orgs, right?
All of them, because that's the Kubernetes project. Like
I'm saying for the release process.
It should be all of them. Like our processes should scale to track the work that's going on in the ecosystem that is targeted at these individual discrete releases that is sponsored by the SIGs. I think that is our responsibility as process owners, because that is the general requirement from the people who are doing the work in the SIGs. Like they're doing this work, we need to give them a place to talk about that work. I think that's a reasonable expectation from the SIGs, that they don't each have to manage their own individual communication channel. Certainly, I don't think that OpenStack would have said that imbuing each of their special interest groups or each of their teams with a strong sense of identity was good for the project overall. And so I'm certainly not trying to follow that same path.
Tim's got his hand up.
So I hear that, and I definitely, parts of me agree, but I think maybe even wrapping back to Nishi's specific question, how do we deal then with cadence? If the idea is that these things split out of KK, but they're part of the org and we have to track them, they're split out so they can run on their own cadences, but then the release team would have to have some sort of a cutoff date by which we collect their information, and then we're determining their cadence. Or
yeah, so that's
sorry, I'm saying that we control when the trains leave. If you are not on the train when the train's leaving, we're not holding the train for you, unless you yourself are release blocking, because you are a whatever air quotes core part of Kubernetes. We cannot release without you. But if you are
in that regard, we could be sort of simple, agile, deferred commitment. If you're ready at this point, we have some arbitrary cutoff later in the release, I guess, and say if you're ready at that point, you're on the train?
Yeah, I think that's fine. I don't think that, there's no expectation on us because it's not staffable to, at the, 1 minute before the release is supposed to go out, be following up with like SIG storage about a plugin. That's not reasonable. But if you're ready when the train is departing, I see no reason to say you're not allowed on the train. But the train's going to leave, and we're not holding the train.
I would support that, Caleb.
Question as the current enhancements lead for these things, Caleb, would they then kind of fall under needing to meet like enhancement freeze to be tracking if they're not on KK?
I think that's a reasonable mechanism that you can use until there's better support for the process, just to help yourselves manage it. You can say that, we're not going to consider tracking new enhancements past this date because we don't have the bandwidth to do so.
So that opens the door for, again, the release team tracking enhancements across the entire project instead of just Kubernetes, which I think was the impetus for part of this conversation.
Yeah, I think that's fine because in a future world, this should have already been the case where code that should be part of the 7 binaries is not all developed in Kubernetes. That just hasn't happened yet. And weirdly, that those repositories get created after the Kubernetes release, which is backwards from how this project was originally, how that engineering effort was originally described. But as soon as that is finished, we're going to be back in this position for, again, the scare quotes core component. So I don't think making the distinction now is particularly helpful because we're not going to be able to build Kubernetes, or at least what users consider to be a Kubernetes cluster or distribution with components that just exist in Kubernetes. Like that's an explicit goal. So I think our process should be ahead of that actual engineering initiative. Otherwise, it's certainly I've not found it to be great when our process is lacking or trailing engineering work.
Okay, so then going back to like a question I think I heard earlier was criteria. If they're being tracked by the release team, they would want to be like considered part of a release to have an issue on the enhancements repo and a KEP that's implementable at the very minimum.
Right, because that's the bar that we're holding the things that are going in tree to. So we're saying what we're saying right now is that we want KEPs for everything, right? And we want KEPs for everything to land in a certain way by enhancements freeze. Is that what we're trying to say right now?
Yes. Because that's the process I think we can roll out to all of the components, regardless of what repo they're in, regardless of what SIG is sponsoring that sub-project.
But that also captures each of those repos in our release process, and they may have a different cadence. I don't think it's fair to bind them to that cadence.
I don't think KEPs are necessarily tied to specific releases. Correct. Most KEPs span multiple releases. So tying them to the release numbers of an external component is just changing the field.
It's not tying the creation of the KEP to the whole point of the part of the point of the KEP is to span multiple release cycles, right? So it's not tying the creation of the KEP to the release cycle. It's tying the expectation that the content of the KEP is accurate and up to date for that release cycle.
Yes, and so I guess I would say it this way. We, as the release team, have control over a resource that people want access to, namely communication about an outgoing Kubernetes release. There's value in being mentioned in that communication. If you want to be part of that train, you must be this tall to ride. I think that's fine. But if you are that tall, you can ride.
So one question. So do we have to tell everybody outside of the main KK repositories to start using KEPs if they want to be named in the change log?
They should already be using KEPs.
Yeah, if if you want access to the, if you want access to this valuable resource, you have no right to it. You will give this you as a privilege. If you meet this bar for quality, you have access to that privilege.
Okay, we'll have to drum up support for this.
Well, I think the support is easy. If you don't care about being mentioned in the official Kubernetes announcements, then do whatever you want. It's fine. Right. If you do, then you have to meet the bar to ride on the release train. And if you have, I guess, I don't have a huge amount of, empathy for people who want to meet whatever bar they want and still be included in the official communications of the project. I think that's just a wholly unreasonable expectation, and I'm totally fine saying that.
That's completely fair.
I've got siblings. They're younger than me. I've got a bunch of experience holding a line here.
So everyone else on the call, I see like release team members, I see product managers, people, if they have opinions, we want to hear that. Don't want it to just be the usual suspects.
Do you want to call out people?
So Kendrick Coleman was a former enhancements lead as well. How do you feel about this process?
I hate it when you call me out like this.
Sorry, Kenny.
No, I'm fine with it. It's an ever evolving thing. So I think we're just gonna have to continue making changes and adjustments as we go. But no, I think especially what Claire laid out was pretty good too.
So we've got Mike as well. Mike is a release team lead shadow for this cycle. Want to give your thoughts here too?
Yeah, I mean, this has come up a bunch, especially with the, especially from my perspective, I guess, in my experience with release notes and third-party vendors trying to get stuff in there. And I just would say that I am somewhat conservative on this topic, and I agree with the folks that say, like, this is not a right that you have, this is a privilege, and that it is not unreasonable of us to either decide that they shouldn't be in there or that there is a high bar for what goes in there and that you must work with the tooling that we specify. And it's especially kind of nice now that with 114 kind of requiring enhancements for everything, it creates a potentially higher quality source of information to make release notes from. So I'm really excited about merging in this release notes tool into the release tooling and continuing to work on integrating the enhancements repo into that, and hopefully just making enhancements the source of truth and making it less easy for people to just slip notes in by having some description in their PR, So I agree with with a lot of the discussion that's been going on today, for sure.
Cool. So I see, let's pick on a few more people. I see Lindsay, Jim, DeWall, and Lubomir. Do any of you have opinions?
I'm just a fly on the wall, man, absorbing it in. No, from a docs perspective, though, I think that it helps having it all in one place, kind of like release notes as well. Some features that, and this is probably a question for, SIG docs is, what goes into the K website, repository, the official documentation for supported features. But like I said, that's probably a different SIG discussion. But yeah, I like where this is headed. I think we're not going to solve it all in one meeting. I think it's going to be try something. If it fails, try something else,
Yeah, I have similar opinions. I think it's also a good opportunity to see how this works out, and we can reevaluate after this release also if there's more things to add or take away.
Yeah, from this discussion, I could derive that Kubernetes release as a 1.14 wouldn't be just single software, but a bundle of multiple things, multiple sub-projects. So I look at this as a tree where 1.14 is the root node, and then all other dependencies, etc., that go into release notes or the docs. They would contain different sub-projects and their versions and a mapping. Yeah, this is how I see it. It's easier to snapshot saying that 1.14 is this, and to know what is not 1.14 release of Kubernetes. At least from the release, I see it like that. So it makes sense to have everything in docs and release notes. Though I think Lubomir in the past had one good suggestion of having the release information as an API, being able to get what is the current release and what is the dependency graph, etc., would be easier. Maybe one day.
We have a bit of a problem there because we have to educate the contributors to manually edit the YAML file. And the YAML file is going to be machine consumable, containing the external dependency of the project. So like most of you know that right now we have to edit these manually, and it's super tedious. So this, I have a cap in mind, but I'm punting this to the next cycle, basically. And also, of course, educating the community is going to be hard. We have to contact a bunch of SIG chairs and instruct them to not accept PRs unless these PRs also touch this YAML file. And like one of the main targets here is going to be the cluster directory. And at the same time, the cluster directory, like the whole topic of moving this directory out is a big one. But yeah, I'm going to make this cap fairly soon after the release.
Or we may want to circle up before you do so, because it would be a shame to do a bunch of work that wouldn't or shouldn't be required. If everything in the cluster directory was itself a cluster bundle, it should be, in theory, much easier to see what are the versions of everything, because, of course, you would have had to specify the versions in order for your cluster to be provisioned in the first place. So I would like to see us start building on the abstractions we're building elsewhere and seeing how we can do that, how we can improve that experience using automation. You mean looking at like a project like Cloud Foundry, certainly we have a bunch of automated release tooling that produces that exact kind of information. And you don't really need to have a human involved because the CI will have told you whether the bump you made to Docker was okay to do or not, because you either got a new cluster bundle out of it at the other end or you didn't.
I was talking about the cluster bundle that people like Justice Santa Barbara is working on.
Yeah, they're supposed to replace everything in that directory.
Yes, maybe we should hold before we have something about the custom bundle, and only then we can like think about how to extract like, the dependencies and stuff. Yeah.
You could also today get some of that information. I mean, it's the way like that. At least when I was putting together that section, the external dependency information, since you had to go to TestGrid to get that information, at least I did. You could, in fact, just pull it from the GCS buckets directly and find it out. But I think you could make much better progress hooking this in to the overall improvements we're making to cluster provisioning. I think the engineering challenge becomes much smaller and is reusable to the actual shipping of the product itself.
Yeah, GCS is a very good idea because we can look the recent images there. So yeah, this makes sense.
I mean, all the information is in places already because it's, I mean, you see the output when you look at TestGrid. So it's in there somewhere. It would just be nicer to pull it out automatically.
There's also the case where a newer image can exist, but technically a certain release of Kubernetes can be on an older version of the image. So we have to think of how to handle this scenario. But yeah, I'm probably gonna write a doc or something like that before a KIP. and see like what is the progress with the poster bundle first. And yeah, I think it might be early for that. But again, the problem here is that the release team this cycle has to manually edit stuff, and it's super tedious.
It is a real pain. But you can use your knowledge and of that tedium to step into a role in the wider SIG release that helps improve that for future release teams. That is always the intention, is once you've identified a problem from service on the release team, to be part of the solution in the wider SIG release. So we can actually have long-term improvements to the processes. Because there is, just too much going on during an individual release to make these kind of larger changes.
So a note there is that a KEP is a document, right? So if we're thinking about doing something like this and you think that it might be too early, I don't think it is. It sounds like we're all on the same page, laying something down. So if you want to put something up around scope and motivation and general goals for this, I think that's valuable.
Sure.
One more perspective I had was if all the sub-projects have KEPs and all the KEPs of Kubernetes main projects have KEPs, then don't we have too many KEPs and we'll run short of reviewers, and per release cycle we'll be under pressure to get, people will be under pressure to get their KEPs out. Would it be okay if, would it make sense if you say, if you want to have a KEP, if you want to implement a KEP in 1.14, you should probably bring it out in 1.13, an expectation like that? Does it make sense?
So go for it, Caleb.
Oh, no, sorry, Stephen.
No, go for it.
I think that as we have more requirements for KEP and more tooling to support the processes, that these things would become more obvious. Like you'll be able to actually work backwards in your head from when you need to get your KEP to be implemented at the implementable state. If you want to target the 1.15 or 1.16 release of Kubernetes. That's just my hope anyway. It'll be easier once how a KEP transitions between the states is a little bit more clear.
Okay.
I feel like that might not matter. People are becoming aware of the cadence already and the need, and hand wave and say most things record a day, and we're just starting this process really of breaking things out. So if there's some awareness here and you're definitely off on your own, but you want to get on the train, it seems like it would be natural to understand that you need to pay attention to the release cycle and not back up a cycle before that. And I would worry if we ended up there, because echoing Caleb, and I'm sure Dim's eyebrows will go up, but the OpenStack blueprints process where you have you get backed up doing definition work so far behind that it slows velocity on things potentially.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Jim mentioned, I agree with. We should try, and if we see we're having too many KEPs, we should then think of a solution. But yeah, right now, putting it in one cycle makes sense.
Yeah, so I don't think that this is a matter of too many KEPs versus too little KEPs. I think it's and it's also not a having process for process sake. I think the overall goal of having KEPs and having something that is refined around the enhancements process means that it's going to be easier to present in any venue, right? So whether it's a contributor site, whether it's a release team trying to figure out what's going to be landing in the release, whether it's a passerby trying to figure out what Kubernetes is or what that new feature is they're looking at, right? I think that this is the initial toil of getting this done is going to the net effect will be huge for people. So I don't think it's a too little or too much thing. I think it's let's make sure we approach it in the right way and drive down some of these concerns early in the game. So we've got 4 minutes left. I posted just now so after finishing the KEP template, there was a set of feedback from the reviewers that y'all can take a look at and add some feedback to that will be incorporated into the KEP template and the surrounding documentation to make sure everyone has eyes on that. So.
Can you link that in the notes section on the KEPs?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you, everybody. That was a good conversation. We keep kind of dancing around this, and that gave some useful focus, and especially Claire, like raising your hand and saying, like, okay, so then what is this actually going to mean for the implementation for this role? So I think that's a key thing not to lose track of.
Ditto. So thank you everyone for showing up. I think it was a really, really valuable conversation, lending your voices to it and helping improve the process. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, right, reach out to us. We're on SIG Release. There's Kubernetes SIG Release at googlegroups.com and all that good stuff. You should know the usual channels. Take it easy.